Our next guest runs one of the most successful large hedge funds in the world. In fact, Bloomberg Markets magazine ranked his Russian Prosperity Fund as the second best performing large hedge fund in 2010, making him a Bloomberg best. Mattias Westman is with us now. He began his $1.2 billion activist fund in Moscow in the year 2000. The fund up 47% in 2010. It has returned more than 2,000% since its inception in 1996. He is with us from London. Mattias, thanks very much for joining us this morning. We know that oil and gas holdings were the most profitable part of the fund last year. Are you counting on that trend continuing in the new year?
Well, I think there's a good chance of that. First of all, we think that the oil prices will remain quite strong. Secondly, the internal dynamics of many of these Russian oil companies are very positive. They're improving, they're modernizing, they're increasing productivity and so on. So I think, and also, of course, quite simply, we start at a very low valuation. Most of these companies trade at a P of around 5. And several of them have dividend yields of between 10 and 20%. So there's quite a lot of upside left in those, I think.
And not just valuation, but how much are fundamentals driving your decision to put money in oil and gas? I mean, how big of a story is China, or how big of a calculation is that in your analysis?
Well, I think not only for the oil and gas companies, but for Russia as a whole, the Chinese story is immensely important. Russia is a large exporter of almost everything that China needs to import. And they're a lower cost producer than anything that they do in China. It costs 30% less to make a ton of steel or a ton of aluminum in Russia than it does in China. And so they are very compatible, and there are a lot of synergies between them. Previously, there were not that much transport infrastructure to deliver to China, but that's being rapidly built out. So the Russia-China trade is definitely booming, and that will be a long, long story. And Russia will be a very large trading partner with China for as long as anybody will care to know.
So, Mattias, if we just wanted to look at the sectors and their weighting in your fund right now, I mean, is oil and gas still the largest part?
Well, it's the largest part, and there are a lot of interesting companies, real value plays there. But at the same time, the Russian economy, and many of the Russian companies, are growing very fast. So we've found a lot of profitable investments in consumer-oriented stocks, in consumer goods, in retailing, and so on. And there you have really good growth because of the very fragmented nature of this industry in Russia. So they're all rolling up the industries and getting better market shares, stronger margins, and that's where you can find a lot of good investments also. So
consumer discretionary, and then I see from our research as well, just power, telecom, transport, a lot of infrastructure calls as well. But I want to get to this, back to this oil point, if you don't mind, because I know that your top three holdings, Bashneft, Lukoil, Gazprom, and I'm just curious, I mean, how do these Russian oil companies compare to other emerging markets, countries like, I'm just thinking of Brazil's Petrobras? I mean, will Russia be able to kind of close this value gap versus Brazil?
Well, there's some similarities and some differences between these companies. Of course, Petrobras is a huge state-controlled company with massive capex programs for the foreseeable future, and therefore may be more similar to a company like Gazprom in Russia. Gazprom is very unpopular right now and trades at a much lower multiple than Petrobras does. But amongst the actual oil companies, there's a big difference. In Brazil, you only have one real big oil company, whilst in Russia you have maybe 10. Amongst the oil companies, there are some companies that are really progressing, modernizing, increasing production in a very impressive way, and generating a lot of free cash flow. Those ones, I think, are the ones who will be generating the most interest amongst investors in the coming years.
Mattias, I know when investors look to emerging markets, countries, of course, they look to tax policy is just one factor. I mean, in Russia, the tax burden is heavier than, for example, in Brazil. Do you anticipate any change from the Russian government on this?
Well, clearly they have a quite heavy tax burden, but it's not maybe quite as heavy as people think, because if you're actually refining, if you're going downstream, the tax burden is much, much less, and therefore they're very profitable and they're downstream. But I also think that there's a chance that the Russian government over the next couple of years will realize that they will need to lower the upstream tax burden in order to get more investment, more production, and therefore a more overall tax revenue.
So you do think within the few years that there could be a change on tax policy, which brings up another point. I mean, how difficult is it, quite frankly, for you to do your job? I mean, I know you speak Russian fluently, so there's no language barrier, but when you look at integrity of data, when companies report their financials, How sure are you that you're getting the true story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, most of the Russian companies are relatively simple businesses, so it's quite easy to see through their accounting to understand if there's something that doesn't look right. And we haven't had very much problems with accounting in terms of corporate governance. But there have been quite a few other corporate governance issues that we've faced over all these years. And I think it's very important to be an active shareholder as we are. We've served on many boards of Russian companies. You know, from time to time we've even had to sue people. But most of all, when we're activists, we're actually trying to help these companies become real corporations, to tell them how to be transparent, to tell them how to do corporate governance, to tell them how to execute their corporate finance problems that they need to resolve. And in that way, if you are a partner with these companies, then I think you're much better protected than if you're just a silent shareholder. Better
to be on the inside than the outside. Thanks very much, Mattias.
Yeah.
Mattias Westman joining us there from London.